Hey guys, welcome back to American Traditions. It's me, Mr. G, and today we're going to be talking about colonial Latin America. And so as we left off, the Spanish and the Portuguese had explored a bunch of new territories, and now they were going to settle them. And so as we enter the 1500s and leave the 1400s behind, Spain and Portugal began to rule over their new lands after the Treaty of Tordesillas. And so Spain created a colonial empire that spanned North America, Central America, and South America, whereas Portugal took their portion of South America in Brazil and continued to dominate the African coast and the Spice Islands. So we see the Spanish colonial empire mainly focused on ports like St. Augustine, Havana in Cuba. In Central America, we had the colony of New Spain, located in modern-day Mexico, and we had colonies in Peru and what is now modern-day Uruguay in the Rio de la Plata area. So Spain is really investing a lot in their colonization of the New World. We see that the Spanish set up viceroyalties throughout Latin America, and Portugal sets up their viceroyalty in Brazil. And so with these new colonies, these new outposts, begins the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is the term that we use to describe the exchange between these continents. Cut off by oceans for millennia, now all of a sudden these continents were linked once more. And when these continents were linked through inter-Atlantic trade, we see a big exchange between different creatures. From Europe, we get many domesticated animals. Cattle, horses, pigs, and sheep were brought to the Americas. But no animals from America really were brought to Europe. But horses would forever change the landscape of America. Really, all of these animals would. Today, the wild pig population is a problem all across the United States, including here in the state of Florida. So when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, we're really talking about a dramatic transformation here in the United States. But the Columbian Exchange didn't just bring animals over, it also saw an exchange of plants. Corn, potatoes, tobaccos, and tomatoes, among other things, were brought to Europe. And so last time we talked about how Marco Polo had brought pasta from Asia to Europe, and so finally now we can make modern Italian food because the tomato has made its way to Europe from the Americas. Other foods were brought from Europe to the Americas. Things like sugar, rice, wheat, coffee, and bananas were brought to the Americas and were soon created in large numbers there. In fact, most of the world's bananas still come from Latin America and the Caribbean. Sugar is a big staple crop here in the state of Florida. So the exchange of these crops really did a number of things. What it allowed people in Europe to do was grow more calories per acre than ever before. See, an acre of potatoes could feed substantially more people than an acre of wheat. And so for the same amount of land, you could feed quite a few people. And so as a result, we see these more calorie-dense American staple crops start to feed Europeans, and populations boom throughout Europe. Unfortunately, animals and food items were not the only things that were exchanged. Because these peoples had been separated for thousands upon thousands of years, that meant that there was no natural immunity to some of these diseases. So whereas Europeans brought some New World diseases home, unfortunately, Europeans brought with them to the New World many more communicable diseases, the most tragic of which was smallpox. Smallpox, which is pictured here, responsible for killing well over 90% of the native inhabitants of the Americas. 90% of Native Americans in North America died within the first 100 years. 96% of Mexican natives died within 80 years of conquest, and 95% of the natives from Hispaniola were killed during this time. And so we see that the spread of this disease, for which there was no natural immunity, led to the massive depopulation of the Americas. One of the things that we also need to talk about are the people who were settling and conquering these territories. And so the conquistadors were Spanish explorers and conquerors in the New World. Many of them were motivated by the 3 Gs. Remember, those are God, gold, and glory. And so the conquistadors saw the downfall of many civilizations, whether it was the Aztecs or the Incas, whether it was the Taino people in Hispaniola. The conquistadors were these dynamic figures who were responsible for leading these expeditions, and sometimes with great courage and sometimes with a bit of ruthlessness. One explorer of note, being from Florida, we got to talk about Juan Ponce de Leon. He's the one who gave Florida its name. Finding Florida on Pascua, Easter, he named Florida La Florida because he saw that it was filled with all this lush green vegetation. Ironically, compared to other states, Florida has the least amount of natural flowers. Cortez is an interesting figure because originally he was friendly to the Aztecs in order to gain their trust. Now mind you, the Aztec Empire was one of the most ruthless empires in what is now modern-day Mexico. They were known for conquering other tribes and sacrificing individuals with careless abandon. Some of their ceremonies required the sacrifice of over 10,000 individuals, men, women, children, even infants. The Aztecs had gotten a pretty bad rep amongst the other tribes of now modern-day Mexico. And so when Cortez gains the Aztecs' trust, he uses this to then take Montezuma hostage in order to secure his safety and his men. He loots Tenochtitlan, and then Montezuma is killed as Cortez leaves for Spain with his small fortune. When Cortez returns, after having looted this kingdom and killed their ruler, he makes allies with the many enemies of the Aztec Empire, and the Aztecs, having been weakened by smallpox due to the original exposure to Cortez and his men, are really in no place to fight back. And so this led to the downfall of the Aztec Empire and the Aztec civilization. It's important to note that Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, is now modern-day Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. This would also be the capital of the Spanish colony of New Spain. While we touched on it earlier, that pre-Columbian civilizations and all these native groups were falling to smallpox and other diseases, as time progresses and we get further away from first contact, the Aztec and Incan empires, the largest in the New World at the time, start to deteriorate. These empires, which had once numbered in the millions and had larger cities than most European cities, within 50 years of European contact, had been completely destroyed, in part due to Spanish conquest, but mostly due to the spread of disease. It's especially tragic from a humanity standpoint when you figure that a lot of these civilizations also lost their written records and their histories along with it. So there will be things that we never get to know about these empires and their history. And so when it comes to Latin America, we're really talking about this area here marked in green and beige on this map. This is what we call Latin America. And so these territories would be under Spanish and Portuguese control for almost 300 years. Really, it's not really till the Age of Revolutions that we start to see these colonies break away and form their own countries. And so this empire across time and space, across a vast ocean, took considerable resources. The Spanish were meticulous record keepers. However, because of the large distances between some of these colonies, I mean, when you talk about the distance from Peru to Spain, you're talking quite a distance because there was no Panama Canal. All ships had to go around the southern tip of South America. So with this challenge in communication, both Spain and Portugal appointed viceroys who would carry out imperial policy in the colonies. They were vested with the power of the crown in these Spanish colonies and in these Portuguese colonies in order to do the bidding of the Spanish crown. Brazil is a very unique part of Latin America because it's Portuguese speaking, it's not Spanish speaking like the rest of Latin America. And it really has a unique culture of its own. Brazil has a very interesting history because while the monarchy exerted its control over Brazil by appointing a viceroy, that viceroy, well, he didn't have a whole lot of power. Because of Brazil's vast size, he was really just kind of the governor general, having very loose control over the other officials that ran the individual districts in Brazil. The local governors had to respond to the viceroy, and the viceroy had to answer to the King of Portugal. Because of their distance, because of the nature of these different colonies and the geography and topography of Brazil, it made it very hard for the viceroy or the Portuguese crown, for that matter, to really enforce policies heavily in their colonies. We see the viceroyalty system really gave a lot of flexibility to this massive empire separated by oceans where it would take months for news to reach from one side of the world to the other. That being said, even though the colonies were part of the larger Spanish Empire, that didn't mean that they were all equal citizens. There was definitely a structure and a class system in these Latin American colonies. You saw that social class was based on status by birth. At the top were the peninsulares. These were the Spanish and Portuguese that were born in Europe. And so being a peninsulare gave you full rights of either Spanish or Portuguese citizen. Below them were the Creoles. These were the children of peninsulares who were born in Latin America. And so they were still given many of the rights, and had they moved back to the Iberian Peninsula, they would have had the same rights as their parents, right? However, because they were born in Latin America, that gave them a separate class than those who were born back in Europe. So beneath those groups, the peninsulares and the Creoles, were numerous social groups. The Spanish had many different distinctions, and I think the best way to explain this is on the next slide. So these casta maps, or these casta paintings, or caste paintings, show the different castes or mixed racial groups in society. So here we see that when a Spanish person marries a Native American, their child is called a mestizo. So when a mestizo and an Español, or a Spaniard, get married, their child is called a castizo. And so this castizo, when they marry a Spanish person, their child will be considered a full full Spaniard. So these caste paintings really shine a light on something that's very different in Latin America than our modern times. It's really interesting to see that they put a lot of thought and a lot of nomenclature into the idea of these different racial groups and these different racial combinations, which is kind of a stark contrast compared to our modern society, where honestly, if somebody says, "Oh, I'm mixed," that's usually good enough. This also shows a very stark contrast when compared to other countries and cultures. Spanish rulers permitted intermarriage, and it was considered fine, right? Marriage between Europeans and Native Americans, their kids were called mestizos. They were mixed, right? In addition, the kids of Africans and Europeans were called mulatto. Nowadays, that term is not considered politically correct and has a bit of baggage with it, so we don't use that term anymore. But this was a general term to describe a mixed race person. It also shows the interconnectedness and coexistence of these groups. Whereas in the American South, this intermarriage and this commingling of races was frowned upon and outright outlawed until later on in American history. As Spain sets up these colonies, mercantilism was alive and fashionable during this time, and the idea was to enrich the mother country with the resources from these colonies. And so the whole point was to extract some sort of resource, either a natural resource that existed there, for example, gold and silver from Peru, or farming was also considered a very viable option. Crops like tobacco in Cuba or sugarcane across the Caribbean, crops like Brazil wood in Brazil, became lucrative cash crops for these colonial powers. And so we see here on this lovely map these trade routes all across the world. Eventually, Europeans are going to find their way across the Pacific to Asia. It's going to create this large string of trade route all across the world, with Portugal holding Brazil and parts of Africa, and Spain holding colonies not only in the New World, but in places like the Philippines. And so these trade routes really create this interconnected system, bringing supplies from the New World into Europe and making the Spanish and Portuguese empires quite profitable. And this is also going to later on spur other European countries to follow suit. Whereas other European countries dealt with Native Americans in different ways, Spain sought to coexist with Native American tribes and bring them into the family of Christians. They wanted to convert natives to Christianity and make them tax-paying citizens of the Spanish Empire. Now, because most natives would not participate in the Spanish economy, Spain set up an encomienda system. This system was basically used by Spain to control and regulate Native American labor, as well as to extract wealth and taxes from the colonies. The idea here was that Native Americans would dedicate a couple days worth of work a month to the crown, where all their labor and the fruits of their labor would be confiscated for the crown. The rest of the month, they would be left to live on their own. This did, however, mean that Spanish colonists, who were given lands by the king to be worked on by the natives, tended to exploit these. And so days would sometimes turn into weeks. When the encomienda system broke down, it led to the enslavement of Native Americans, which had been banned since the initial trip by Columbus to the New World. Queen Isabella of Spain had said that these natives were to be considered equal subjects and citizens of the Kingdom of Spain. So for their rights to be abused like this and to be treated as slaves when the encomienda system broke down was a real affront. Another responsibility in the encomienda system was that in exchange for their labors, natives were to be taught how to speak and read in Spanish and to be given a proper Christian education. And so this meant that Catholic orders like the Dominicans, the Jesuits, and the Franciscans would set up schools and missions to spread the gospel throughout Latin America. The encomienda system led to a lot of abuses. One Catholic priest in particular who saw these abuses and thought that he had to speak out about it was Bartolomé de las Casas. And so he wrote at length about the abuses here. I have them here in this book here, which is a brief account of the devastation of the Indies. This book was originally written as a series of letters detailing the harsh treatment of the natives at the hands of the Spanish colonists. The crown would finally outlaw the encomienda system in 1720 as a result of de las Casas' writing and petitioning. While this was great news for the Native Americans, unfortunately, this began the process of the Spanish importing African slaves to make up the difference. While it's going to be different while we review the British colonies in North America, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies were determined to Christianize the indigenous people, and the Catholic Church contributed to this project. Every Spanish square in Latin America would have a cathedral, a government building, and a market. And so Catholic missionaries were sent to convert and educate Native Americans all across what is now Central and South America. They built missions, they built cathedrals, they built hospitals, schools, the different monastic orders in the Catholic Church. The Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits fanned out all across the Spanish Empire. My grandmother, who was born in Cuba, even went to a Jesuit school that had been founded during colonial times. So these missions really had a long-lasting effect on the world, especially here in the Americas. That's all I got for you guys today. Thank you again for tuning in. This has been American Traditions. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you haven't hit that notification bell to get all the updates, go ahead and go do that. My name is Mr. G, and I'll see you guys next time.
Storybox Audio.